So we really have an all-star panel here of people from a wide variety of backgrounds to continue our discussion about the bit license. In reverse chronological order, we have Brooks Gibbons, who's the co-founder and general partner of the FinTech Collective. Brooks is a repeat entrepreneur in the FinTech space who has sold 3 companies to Reuters, Microsoft, and Gemalto. He's founded the FinTech Collective and has invested in virtual currency-related companies such as TradeBlock. We also have Mary Dent from DCIQ. Mary runs DCIQ is a consulting firm that helps empower entrepreneurs, providing insight into public policy issues affecting businesses, including virtual currencies. Mary previously served as general counsel and vice president of public policy at Silicon Valley Bank, where she assisted the bank on a number of public policy issues. We also have Constance Choi, who's a member of the board of directors of the Digital Asset Transfer Authority, which is a self-regulating organization for digital currency companies. And prior to joining Data, Constance worked for several, at least one digital currency-related startup herself, and also worked at several large law firms. We also have Jerry Brito, the executive director of Coin Center, a nonprofit research and advocacy center focused on public policy issues facing the cryptocurrency technologies, which has been funded by several prominent venture capitalists, including Andreessen Horowitz, Union Square Ventures, and RRE Ventures. Prior to joining Coin Center, Jerry had a stint in academia, and he was director of the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. We also have Perry Ann Boring, founder and president of the Chamber of Digital Commerce, which was the first DC-based trade association dedicated to promoting digital currencies. And prior to forming the Chamber of Digital Commerce, Perry Ann served as an economic analysis for network cable news program, and also was a contributor to Ford's. And last but certainly not least, we have Jeff Alberts, who's a partner at Prior Cashman and a former assistant AUSA in the Southern District. He's counseled cryptocurrency companies and was awarded the 2010 Department of Justice John Marshall Award for his service at the U.S. Attorney's Office. So, I think we heard a lot of really interesting things from the superintendent, and I think the real issue here is, I think was mentioned multiple times, which is we're at the intersection of a highly regulated industry and a technology industry, and they're kind of in a collision course. And the open question, which it seems like we need answers to, is what's the right way to ensure that young startups can thrive in this industry while at the same time kind of addressing the regulatory issues that are implicit when you deal with financial products. Anybody have a thought?
So why don't I kick it off and say, I would sort of frame it less as a collision course and more like an opportunity for both sides, right? For an industry that is in much need of innovation. The superintendent did a fantastic job of outlining all the ways that Bitcoin and similar cryptocurrencies could help improve things like the cost of transactions, the amount of time the transactions take, allowing things that can't be done today, using smart contracts and other things that are too difficult to get into right now. So that's a huge opportunity that the technology presents. And you have to fully realize that this is an industry that the technologists are moving into that is heavily regulated for a reason. And I think the superintendent laid out that he has an obligation to carry out those regulations, but he's fully aware that if he goes too far, he's going to give up some of those benefits that he outlined. So it's a tough balance, but I think it's one that can be struck, and it seems that they're working to strike. And so I'm very happy to be engaged in that process to figure that out.
And just to follow up. Just to follow up on that, I would say it's not so much a conflict as it is a paradigm shift that we're going through. It's an evolution. I think that, with all this excitement of digital currencies, we forget that and the fact that we take the internet for granted today, we forget that it was a grand experiment. The internet was experimental and it improved over time. And there were some fundamental problems with the internet that were built out as the infrastructure was built out. So security, for one, SSL was added later, mobility, cloud computing, that was added later. And the reason why the internet was able to develop so robustly is because it's decentralized and because it doesn't require permission from anyone, any entrepreneur or inventor, to start testing out new business models on it. And so you're seeing the same, the internet really disrupted the centralized model to a decentralized model across many industries. You're seeing that in Airbnb, in the hotel industry, taxis, and whatnot. And now you're seeing that in money, and it's really challenging our traditional notions of centralized authorities, record keeping and reporting from closed shops. It really is upending all of our paradigms of how we regulate these businesses, how we connect with each other. And so you can imagine if we had required people on the internet to wait a year and a half and spend millions of dollars before building on top of it, that would have really, really changed the fundamental evolution of the internet as we know it today. So the challenge here really is how do we, we're moving from centralized models to decentralized models. Bitcoin has done that. Bitcoin literally is a decentralized network along which these digitally native bits of data can move, that we've prescribed a value to. And then, how do we square that with the public policy mandates and the regulatory process that takes months and don't have that subject matter experts? So, that's why you're seeing all these new forms of engagement. You're seeing these bit license proposals. You're seeing these task forces that are being built by these regulatory agencies to address these issues. It's because we really need to deal with new ideas of governance and new ways of engaging stakeholders, including subject matter experts, to get to the right answer. And so I think it's just another evolution of that, and that to see really Bitcoin and these decentralized models as just another technological evolution of the infrastructure of the internet that's connecting us together.
I guess I'd add, I think there's a lot of alignment, and I think we're probably not focusing as much. I agree, I'm a big fan of startups, but I think that to ask a policymaker to try and protect startups, actually ask them to do something that's not really their mandate. And so I'd switch it a little bit and say, where is there fundamentally an enormous amount of alignment between these small companies and the objectives that the regulators are there to protect? And I think there's a lot. I think that by and large, if you're trying to create a disruptive business for consumers, you need to be thinking a lot about what's going to make consumers happy. And so the whole way you think about consumer protection in a world where fundamentally you really want the same thing doesn't mean nobody will make mistakes, but it does mean your objectives are similar. It's very different than when you think about regulation as a way to stop bad actors. I think a second place is the whole area of cybersecurity. If a company allows itself to be hacked, and you've seen this with some of the big companies, that can be an existential question. They may not survive that. So again, there's an enormous amount of alignment around that core issue. Very hard to carry out, as we see every day, to really protect a network from any attack. But the goal of protecting the network from attack is there, whether you're the entrepreneur, the investor, or the regulator. And so I think when you can get back to these, what social values are we all trying to achieve? And then what's the right way to do them? I think one risk we have in today's environment, where we've got a lot of rules, is I think human beings can mostly think of one thing at any given time. Maybe I'm more limited, but here's how I think about it. If I'm thinking, what's the right thing to do, I can solve that problem. If I've got 13 different states and rules for this, that, and the other, and I'm thinking, what's the regime that checks the box so that I'm not in violation of any of these regimes, I'm answering a very different problem. And so when is regulation actually, we've lost building on the alignment that exists, and instead set up a structure that's actually taking people away from worrying about what's the smartest way to deal with the very real threat of cybersecurity, the very real threat of fraud and criminal activity, and the very real need to deliver better outcomes to consumers, and taking them away from answering that question by having such a rigid structure that now what they're answering is, how do I tick the boxes and comply? And I think if you can start to think about it that way, rather than how do I protect startups, you can start to really think creatively about how would you do this differently. I think Constance's point, this is a different world and new things are possible. It's unlocking a different thought process. It's much more collaborative. And who really in the system is well suited? Right now, banks, by and large, find it very hard to serve Bitcoin companies. Why aren't they a part of the conversation to say what can't be done inside a small startup that does need to be done, like some of the law enforcement stuff? maybe there's a way that banks could step up and do that on an aggregated platform where the costs are spread over a large number of different companies, rather than trying to do it inside each of these small startups. So it's that different way of thinking around what are we trying to achieve, where are we aligned, and I want to give you some freedom because I actually think you're trying to achieve the same thing I'm trying to achieve, and where is regulation actually detracting from that fundamental message, and then reserve the heavy-handed regulation for the places where alignment doesn't exist, and you really do need to take a more aggressive stance as a regulator to protect the public that you're protecting.
So, Mary, I think you just hit on this, but there's a lot of compliance costs. So, Brooks, I mean, you're voting with your dollars when you look to companies. Like, how does compliance costs and issues like that frame how you look at potential investments or potential companies in this space?
So I think a lot of the companies that are startups and trying to innovate today are actually trying to do things in smarter, better, faster, cheaper ways to avoid some of the compliance costs. There's administrative and application cost, there's daily operational cost, but part of that cost at scale is due to the size of these institutions, right? And so right now in the topic of discussion tonight, we're not sure what the costs are, and I actually think that one of the most interesting questions is that if you do adopt sort of as Mary suggested, a paradigm shift, and Constance suggested, and thought about this in a new way, one of the questions is how do you actually frame regulation in a decentralized manner? And I think that from our perspective, where we've had 1,200 meetings this year, we've looked at 800 companies over the last 18 months. One of the things that when you're so close to that we see is how profoundly different this cycle of innovation is from what's happened that everybody has the reference points for, which is Silicon Valley over the last 25 years. Silicon Valley has essentially been a single epicenter of innovation. And when you look at finance, particularly in today's market, you have to look at it from a global perspective. It's very easy as entrepreneurs to think about Silicon Valley or the US. It's very easy if you're in finance to think about New York. But the reality is that these companies, and this is all going to unfold on a global basis. And I'm really keen to do what we can to facilitate discussion and get the alignment so that Superintendent Losky and other regulators approach this with, he's the one who said it needs to be tailored, regulated, and justified. And I'd love to make sure that it's also in context with what's happening in other parts of the world. Because we really are at this moment in time, and I don't want to over-dramatize this, right? But we're at a moment in time where the U.S. has an opportunity to continue to lead in innovation, but there are other regulatory markets around the world, particularly in London, for example, that are taking a much more progressive, much lighter weight, much quicker to adopt and enable approach to this than we're at risk of taking in the U.S.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point. So, I mean, once the bit license gets implemented in final form, I mean, what impact, just because of the role that New York plays in the financial markets, do you think it will have? I know we have some people on the panel who have who are in D.C. and kind of have a global perspective, but I'd be curious to know what your sources and people you've been talking about, what they've been saying about the bit license and how they're kind of digesting it.
So I think one of the biggest issues or biggest sort of points to realize is that this is off and running, right? So over the last 12 months, the aggregate value of Bitcoin, the market cap, so to speak, is tripled. So it's about $5.5 billion. In that same period of time, the aggregate computational power against the blockchain has increased by over 200 times. So this is happening. It's happening in a decentralized way. And I think one of the biggest sort of things to realize and opportunities is that this could reach a scale of adoption and ubiquity in developing markets before it happens in developed markets. And that opens up, from our perspective, that opens up a tremendous amount of opportunity. You talk about remittance, it costs 8 to 9%. I'd say it's 8 to 20%. You talk about countries in Africa and emerging markets where actually holding fiat or currency, the second you hold it, you become a target. You talk about being able to put contractual or programmatized conditions on the use and the distribution of funds. Imagine today if you wanted to get money to, this is my 4-year-old's favorite, or my 6-year-old, I guess, it's an elephant orphanage in Africa, right? If I wanted today to get money to help that elephant orphanage in Africa, how could I do that in fiat or traditional currency? The net of it would be that I would have stripped probably 16 to 18 cents out of every dollar before it actually got there. So I think from our perspective, the bit license is approached with some optimism because it lends credibility and it facilitates potentially the involvement of institutions. And that is fundamental because we need to see a 1 to 2 times order of magnitude increase in the volume. But there's also great concern that there will be a very broad brush painted, and that the understanding between currencies and software providers and currencies in the blockchain may not be fully understood.
There's actually a really interesting tension going on. Through our work with data, we've been talking with regulators from around the world and foreign finance ministers, and especially in some of these smaller jurisdictions that are eager to promote innovation in their own countries, you're seeing this tension between having to create financial regulations that harmonize with the leaders in the EU and the US, but also, taking advantage of the fact that this is a globally interoperable technology, and that there's a real opportunity for a smaller country to lead in regulations. So you're seeing this dual race to the top and race to the bottom in regulations, and it's going to be really interesting to see what shakes out of that. I think that, for most people that I've talked to, the bit license proposal, regulations as proposed, would not likely be accepted, and you'd probably see a significant amount of legislative arbitrage. I was actually on a panel with the head of the Conference of State Banking Supervisors Virtual Currency Task Force, and he seemed to welcome comments to bit license and, more than hinted at the availability of other states to do business in as a counterweight. But I think that, again, like the larger question really is, not just regulations and how we adapt it, but what are the policy goals behind regulations, and how does it fit in this technological context? How do we craft and adapt these rules to achieve those same policy goals in this context, rather than merely expanding data collection, merely expanding the surveillance machinery? So, for example, credit cards were made for point of sale. Documentary IDs were made for physical verification. So, rather than just expanding these old centralized tools that were made for point of sale and physical, contact, rather than just expanding the collection of that and the passage of that through our nodes, maybe we need to think of more creative ways of enabling trust in counterparties, enabling sovereignty over your identity on decentralized networks. And so that just takes time, and regulators have a mandate right now to act. So there's a bit of a vacuum here, and a lot of uncertainty, and people trying to fill that vacuum of uncertainty with a lot of either expansive regulations or maybe not as careful thought out regulations. So it's going to be really interesting to see what happens in terms of whether this is going to be a holistic refashioning of our systems, or whether you're going to see these little pockets of jurisdictions trying to adapt regulations in a way that promotes businesses in their own countries.
So to answer your question, Aaron, I think it's not really possible at this point to tell what the reaction is going to be to the bit license, because we don't know what the bit license looks like yet. I think that if it was promulgated as written right now, we've seen some companies state that they would not do business in New York. So I think it's great to hear Superintendent today mention that it's being revised extensively, and that I think is going to address a lot of the concerns of those companies. But it's true that there are certain pieces that he didn't mention today that are still outstanding, and that I know that that DFS is struggling with that are essential. So, for example, the bit license as written today requires all parties to a transaction, or it requires a bit licensee to make a record of all parties to a transaction, and that is fundamentally at odds with the cryptocurrencies and the Bitcoin protocol. It sort of gets to that alignment issue that you were talking about. So that's I think where, before we think about regulatory arbitrage, we need to just get this one right, and I think that's one place I would look at. Another place would be sort of the non-financial uses of Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies. I could tell the superintendent was struggling with that one, because yes, these are going to ultimately be financial transactions that are happening. Say, for example, you want to register a domain name using Namecoin, or you want to register a marriage, as recently was done on the blockchain using proof of existence. These are incredibly tiny transactions. You could use 1/1,000,000th of a Bitcoin. So at $400 right now, that's 0.00004 cents. So yes, it is a financial transaction, but I would encourage DFS to perhaps have a de minimis amount in the pennies, and that would help.
Well, my initial reaction to the original proposal was that this would be harmful to small businesses and entrepreneurs for the compliance reasons that we're talking about here. But I thought Superintendent Zlotowski's comments were actually very encouraging, because he does seem to recognize that there are huge compliance burdens for small businesses. So how does a startup get started up if they're having to go through millions of dollars worth of compliance from day one? So what we've done is we've put together a working group, which several people in this room and others within the community are contributing to offer more in-depth comments on how we can improve on the original proposal. And one thing that we're grappling with, and it kind of sounds like what Ben Losky was alluding to, is a small business exemption, or possible an incubator phase for small businesses. And some of the questions that our working group is currently working through right now is, a safe harbor or a de minimis provision, and what exactly that would look like, and who should be the person to decide what that level is. And also, what kind of exemption and what kind of oversight, and is there a way to streamline communications directly to DFS to be able to pull out nefarious actors? So I think that there's a lot of room for improvement, and we have to recognize that it is important to allow startups to get started up, because that's where the majority of jobs in this country stem from. And having a safe harbor for that level of innovation is extremely important, and I thought it was encouraging that it seems that the department is also recognizing the importance of small business here.
So Jeff, I mean, you're a former prosecutor. You've counseled startups. I mean,
Yes.
what are you telling them when they come to you? What advice are you giving them? And when the bit license comes into effect, what are you going to tell them?
Well,
are you going to tell them to avoid New York, or I mean, what do you think you're going to say to them?
yeah, entrepreneurs, and I think several people at this table tend to have a very positive, upbeat attitude. They like to say yes, and they like to figure out a way to say yes. And as a lawyer, my instinct is to say no. And so there's always kind of that back and forth. And my reaction was similar to Perry Ann's in terms of the comments that the superintendent made were very positive, and he used the rhetoric that was very positive. But at the same time, the fact that he says he's concerned about the incredible costs that are going to be imposed on very small businesses doesn't mean that there is a potential solution out there. It may well be that at the end of the day, he's going to require the same type of compliance requirements in terms of know your customer requirements, CIP requirements, AML requirements, cybersecurity requirements that are imposed on banks, and there might not be a solution. I thought one thing that was very promising about what he said is that they are very conscious of carving out those types of platforms and software that don't have an essentially financial component at their base. But at the end of the day, it's very possible that there isn't going to be a solution. All the smart ideas in the world may not convince the DFS to eliminate those types of requirements. And the second step that people have mentioned is the possibility of avoiding the imposition of these hurdles through some type of jurisdictional arbitrage, where you either base your company outside of New York, or you base it outside the United States and try to carve out New York customers. And I think that's going to be difficult because I think, for one thing, you want to include New York. It's a vibrant financial center. But in addition, I think Superintendent Lasky was right that other jurisdictions are very likely to adopt the regulations that New York adopts, because right now there's not a competing full set of regulations that are out there. New York is very influential. And really, at the end of the day, the same concerns that are driving the DFS's decision to impose these Know Your Customer and CIP requirements are banking regulators in all of the states are going to have the same concerns. So I think it will be difficult to solve the problem with arbitrage. I think it's possible that there isn't going to be a solution that works for every company, but I don't think it's going to kill the industry. I think there are incredibly vibrant platforms that are being developed that aren't focused on financial currencies. And I think the worst case scenario is that the solution to the compliance problems will have to come from more well-established financial institutions, either through outsourcing those compliance efforts to banking institutions or similar institutions that have that capacity, or coming up with some way to solve the compliance problem through mergers or different companies all devoting common resources to solving the compliance problems. But I think there is a real problem that some people are going to have to say no. And I've talked to a variety of startup companies, and some of them have models that I've been able to counsel them. This is okay. You can go forward, and there's not a potential conflict. But there's other institutions where there's other startups where there's a real risk, and some of them have decided not to go forward yet because of their concern over starting up a business that is going to immediately be crushed by a regulation that they currently don't fully understand. So sometimes I think you have to counsel no.
Yeah.
Can I just,
Yeah.
I think one of the reasons it gets to be such a tangle is you can't really talk about compliance costs. That would be like talking about, do you spend the right amount? Well, you spend money on different things, and that changes. So to me, the idea of opening up a hole through which terrorism financing can run is the urgent question that really needs to be solved to unlock everything else. That no regulator here or abroad who is serious about their job is going to let a de minimis exception or anything else come into place if it creates a hole through which bad people funnel money to do terrible, terrible things. And we shouldn't hope that they do, not for startups or anything else. And so, that's the place where you really don't want regulatory arbitrage to happen. You don't want that hole to be created anywhere, because once created, it can be used to move something globally. So figuring out how do you solve this problem of really creating a scalable solution that prevents money laundering and terrorism financing, that works from tiny institutions to big institutions, that doesn't replicate the silos that we've got, which have led to a financial system that doesn't work in a lot of other ways. That's a global question, and that's something that we want to get right. We want to figure it out, and then we actually want a fairly similar standard globally. And it's never going to be, right, people use cash, people use credit cards. Criminals are using whatever method they can, and they're always changing. So that'll be a constantly evolving question, but we need to get it right. I think where you can really back off on some of this stuff would be consumer protection, for example. So if all wallets are below a size that we say, yeah, it's okay. If people want to take risk with that amount of money, we're fine with that. Then you could have a very permissive regulatory regime around consumer protection and give the industry a decade or 20 years to grow up. Credit cards weren't regulated from the get-go. It took 20 years for those regulations to really come into form. Prepaid cards are a newer, somewhat similar thing to credit cards, but they're not regulated today in the same way or as pervasively as credit cards. So I think if you start to say it's not about compliance, but about what is, and somebody said this, I think it was Constant, what problem are we trying to solve? Which problems are urgent? Which problems can we give a little bit of time to? Where can we create some room that we're willing to take some risks, the downside's not that bad? And where do we really need to figure it out and come together to figure it out and get it right? That's where you can start to have real conversations that lead to workable answers. Compliance cost is just, it's too generic a term that brings in too many different, very dissimilar threads to really answer that question.
I'm actually a little skeptical of the idea that a central bank or our existing legacy players will be the best suited to come up with the tools for a decentralized environment. Just based on, I have banks as some of my clients, and the cost of compliance is so, and compared to the efficacy of what they're actually catching, and then the reputational harm that happens when one bad actor inevitably gets through their system because their systems aren't perfect, it's a huge burden for banks. Banks can't make innovative moves in the industry because if something bad happens, there will be a firestorm of PR. And so even though everyone knows it happens, it can happen, and it may be a very small portion of it, they're just, because of the reputational risk, they're not able to act. And so, I think that we talked a lot about the paradigm shifts at the beginning, but really you're seeing kind of the real tension, really, I think, is between the immediacy of users being able to touch their technology, to send messages instantly, to create a wallet. We no longer have gatekeepers to all of these functions: communication, information, money. And so this idea, and then you have this increasingly complex systems that are too hard and too complex for regulators and existing stakeholders to really understand, those policymakers that are supposed to set rules for that. So where the twain shall meet is really, I think, where the rubber hits the road. And I think it's going to take permissionless innovation. I think it's going to take subject matter experts. It's going to take experimentation. And how do we create a climate that allows these risk and time-bound experiments, reducing risk to consumers while allowing these innovations to grow? And so, making sure these moving pieces are set so that those policy goals of both innovation and safety and soundness are met, that's going to be the real trick.
So,
I just want to say, I don't think the regulators will come up with it. I'm just saying that the answer has to be acceptable to them. But I do think it takes thinking differently.
I just wanted to add that I think that in addition to affecting startups, what these compliance, what compliance costs do, if DFS or if a regulator has too stringent AML KYC policies, it's not just that the compliance costs affect startups. It is also that when it affects startups and when it affects other companies who don't engage in the ecosystem, the regulator loses visibility into that ecosystem, thereby undercutting the whole purpose of what they're trying to do. And why is that? It's because ultimately these systems are decentralized, and you can ultimately connect to them directly. And so if you wanted to do something nefarious, you could do that. And if you have successfully driven out all of the good actors through onerous compliance, you have less visibility. You want actually to have as many folks engaged with the system, interacting with as many people in and out of your jurisdiction who are reporting to successfully do what you want to do as a regulator. So it's not just, it's definitely the compliance costs are going to affect startups, but in addition to that, it might affect your AML KYC goals ultimately.
I think that builds on effectiveness. So not only are companies in this space held accountable by regulators to have effective compliance programs, it's not only good enough just to have a compliance officer, but you have to be able to prove that your programs are effective. But what about on the other side? Are these regulations effective? And we've had two of the biggest and most well-funded companies in this space, Circle and Zappo, have both said that they're ready to block New York IP addresses and they won't do business here. So could this make New York Siberia? And I think it's interesting if we could have some kind of cost-benefit analysis. What is the cost-benefit of this regulation? And is it going to be effective? Because if it drives everybody out of New York, did we accomplish those goals that you were originally talking about? So, I think we are really looking forward to the next set of proposals coming out of New York. And I would like to see also the department's response to Circle and Zappo, who are two companies who are very transparent and dedicated to growing this economy in an ethical way. How is that going to change the dynamic here and business here for New Yorkers?
So we've been talking about decentralized networks, decentralized computing. It sounds very oddly familiar to the 1990s. I mean, is there any lessons that we can kind of draw from previous battles where, technology is intersected with, with regulated entities in terms of telecom, in terms of just internet policy? I mean, what lessons can we draw and, do you think would be helpful to impart upon the new set of regulators, which is these financial regulators?
So I think one lesson from issues related to cryptography from the late 90s is that ultimately cryptography is speech and is protected by the First Amendment. And so as regulators look at how rules apply to different software products, I was very happy to hear the superintendent say that developers in software would not fall under the bit license. But they should, they need to be cognizant of where something is financial and where something is speech. And I think right now those lines are blurring, so it's going to be very interesting to see how the First Amendment plays here.
Well, definitely, no one wants to be the person that said the internet is a fax machine. So we have that in our favor. So I think that's actually been the biggest boon and the lesson of the internet is the stakeholders now don't want to be wrong, and they've seen this movie before, and this might be the same movie again, and even a bigger movie. So there's a cautious respect for what they don't know. So that's good. That's always good. It's recognizing what you don't know is usually the first step to fixing the problem. In terms of also the lessons of the internet, permissionless innovation wins, and it builds better products. And so how do we create an environment that allows that to grow in a responsible way? And I think that, and then also, the lesson of the internet is, we're increasingly, a global economy really challenges these jurisdiction, geographic-specific rules. And so, Bitcoin really is at the intersection, this 21st intersection of big data and privacy, our financial network, social networking, the internet. And it's really challenging a lot of our traditional notions of how we build law and how we build regulations. And so, I think that hopefully the lesson of the internet is permissionless innovation is important, safe harbors are important, that there are maybe paradigm shifts that we need to do in governance models and in building regulations as much as we do on the technology side.
So we sit at a very interesting position in that we're looking at fintech companies from Silicon Valley to London to Sydney and all points in between. And I think that one of the things that is just so different today from 25 years ago is the principle of the U.S. as the domain and genesis of ultimate innovation. And in the next 10 years, in the next 15 years, it's just not going to look like that. There is a much more balanced flow of capital and talent and ideas. The ability to execute, the cost to execute is a fraction of what it was. And so, wouldn't it be great if for every, sort of like you cut a tree, you plant 10 more principle, wouldn't that be great if every, new law coming from regulators, they also had to propose 3 or 4 others that helped stimulate innovation. And we have such an incredible inherent advantage in New York City, where we have the confluence of institutions, we have the confluence of talent, we have the confluence of tech talent, we have the diversity of the ad tech, the media, and the fashion industries. There's no other city in the world who has all of those assets, and the volume of the dialogue is around protecting a consumer, not around how do we become the leader of innovation in financial technology globally. My partner is at an event tonight at the British consulate, and the audience there is in a different attire than the audience here. It's predominantly entrepreneurs, and the UK and London really views itself as a global center of finance, and they're doing things to stimulate aggressively the innovation in the context of the institutions and in the context of law, respected law. So I think that we're in a dramatically different place than we were in the 90s.
So
Can I offer three quick, really quick
Yeah,
things?
of course.
My three things from the internet would be 25 billion euro, eBay, and Skype. 25 billion is the amount McKinsey estimates that consumers in the United States and Europe get for free, net for free from the internet. That above and beyond what they pay in actual costs, as well as loss of privacy and other things, how much free stuff they get from Google search and email and all this kind of stuff. The internet, an open system yields very different outcomes than a closed system. And we all know what kinds of outcomes the traditional financial system yields. It does many things effectively, but it's very expensive and very bad for low-income consumers. So we could have a better outcome in a more competitive, open, changing environment. Two is eBay. eBay was built upon the premise, it's not that they don't know that there are bad people out there, but you can build different things when you build around trust. And we have the opportunity to say, how could we rethink financial rules, which have not been working that well for most Americans, to say, what if you built a financial regulatory system built around trust? It is not naive, it doesn't say there are no bad guys, but it does yield very different outcomes. And third is Skype. We had the discipline when voice over internet came along to say we're not going to throw it in the same old telecommunications regime that applied to telephone calls. That's what the states wanted to do. And I can now use my mobile phone for free and talk to my son in India for hours and hours and hours, and that is something that never, ever, ever would have happened if we assumed that the old rules had to apply. And so I think that we have to start using these kinds of analogies to say that sometimes it's scary, but when you think differently, good things rather than bad things can happen, and we need to have some discipline to try some new things and see where we can create better outcomes through new approaches.
Yeah, one fundamental issue that you see come up whenever you're talking to a government regulator or a government enforcer is that there's all these potential positives out there, but as individuals, and I used to work in the government, so I know this, the pressures on you are not to create those positives. So the SEC gets yelled at when there's fraud. The SEC doesn't get a big pat on the back when the market does 2% better because of the great job that they did regulating the market. And similarly, FinCEN, while we want to focus on the potential upside, they get in a lot of trouble if transactions go through that are criminal transactions on their watch, but they don't get any pat on the back whatsoever from their boss if the market goes up 2 or 3%. And so given the personal incentives of these government actors, it's difficult. The balance tends to be towards over-enforcement. And so I think as we engage with them, it's important not just to convey our message to them as individuals, but to use our ability, whether it be through community organizations or trade groups that represent different entrepreneurs in the space, but to engage in politicians that are outside of the enforcement community, because the enforcers the incentives that they face on a day-to-day basis are going to always push them towards over-regulation. So it's important to engage government actors that are outside of the enforcement community if you want to get a set of regulations that really is going to allow the industry to develop as it should, to flourish as it should for society as a whole.
I think you raised an important question about influencers, right? And I think it's interesting to think about this potential set of regulations and think about who the primary influencers are, because in every set of regulation there's always some persona that are not visible that are definitely influencing, and typically they're the most well-funded. And in this case, you might say that that's the big global financial institutions, but right now they can't touch this because of reputational risk. So the likelihood that they're offering influence on what this regulation might look like is pretty low. And if you look to other countries, the voice of influence that stepped in are the civic and the governmental leaders. So in the City of London, it's the mayor. It's the chancellor in the UK, and it's people who have taken this beyond just the context of the financial system and said this has an impact on our economy, on our competitiveness, on our viability, and that becomes a significant voice of influence. And I don't know if we have that here. If Bloomberg were, that could be a long set of conversations. Bloomberg's not, but Obama's distracted. Where I don't know whether there's a civic or a political voice who's representing that in this conversation.
So maybe one more question, then we can open it up to questions from the audience. But Brooks, you mentioned, that you think that it's important that governments and other regulators encourage innovation. As a lifelong New Yorker, the financial industry I know is the heart of this town. And in what ways, if you were wearing a regulator's cap or were in charge for a day, what types of things would you put in place to encourage innovation here?
I'll answer very shortly and let others answer. I think I would get on a plane and go to some other countries, and I'd go to some other ecosystems, and I'd ask the current regulators whether they've done that. Because I think in all of this, an element of perspective is materially required. And the context around us today is just very, very different than it's ever been in the past. And it's different than what we even feel in the most powerful city in the world. So I'd love to see that perspective incorporated, and I hope that it is. I will be the optimist and voice on the panel.
Does anybody have any questions for the panel?
Yeah.
Thank you so much. It's all very, very helpful. It does feel like there's two discussions happening. One which feels very much aligned with what I think would be the alignment of people's benefits with digital technologies, and I think like this $4 trillion of value to be unlocked, over 60% of it is consumers by the ability of us to start getting rid of the waste inside of the system, which is about to unlock this new redistribution of wealth at a different pace than we've seen it before. And then there is the startup versus big company discussion. It feels that whenever you get to startup versus big company, it's do you like my dog or do you want an elephant? I can use both. It depends, what my need is. Do I want to chase people away? Do I want to go in the jungle? So I feel like one discussion of startup versus big companies is where everybody gets afraid that big companies are going to take over. But if we are just aligning the benefit of people and the ability of people to generate new assets through digital technology, and we're channeling this in a way that they get their access to it, and we're constantly do that. And since we have a global scale now to be able to do that by example in multiple places in one place, doesn't that enable us as companies to start having these discussions better than just within the national perspective discussions that we have? Like, is it almost the role of the startups to kind of step in and say, look, we're generating so much income per individual in all these different places, and if we apply it here, that would be 60% less in the US than it could be in China per capita. So if you want to lose that GDP opportunity, aren't those kind of discussions even easier now if we were to have our service of people discussion rather than the don't block the startups, don't kind of get this? I feel like first discussion is clear when we help people get this first.
So I'll say two very quick things. One, it is happening, but we're so early in this, right, that we're not even, it's somewhat odd that regulation is being proposed that could be so impactful when we are just barely out of the gate, right? So that's an oddity. The second is that something has run against the ability for the innovation to happen, and that is the art of the infinitely possible, right? And there's a problem inherent in Bitcoin and the blockchain is in that there are so many different potential use cases that it's fragmented the conversation. And so particularly when we're talking about regulators, if communities can get together and simplify all of this down into 1, 2, 3 use cases, which are very tangible. Remittance, is somebody dealing with remittance the same as a merchant acquirer? There are other examples. And I think those two things, so it is happening. I do think there's an inherent challenge in how it's evolved to date.
So I think that part of the reason why these two discussions happen at the same time is because this great redistribution of wealth that you allude to, or that you say, well, where does that redistribution come from? It comes from typically a big company that today is capturing some rent, possibly because of the regulation that's in place that keeps them as an incumbent. That redistribution will happen if a disruptor, which typically is going to be a small startup, is allowed to innovate and to disrupt, and et cetera. So that's why that happens, and I think we can't lose sight of that. That's a fact. I think it may be the case that someday we'll see a big company enter a new market using this technology and disrupt another big company. But because of these reputational issues, they're not touching it right now. So I'm not giving you an answer except to say that that's, I think, why this discussion happens at the same time. And so a regulator that wants to allow for this innovation to happen needs to keep in mind that sometimes the well-intentioned regulations that they are charged with developing and enforcing might have some unintended consequences of being a barrier to entry and figuring out a way to ease those barriers so that smaller, new innovators can come in.
I actually love talking about Bitcoin to anybody, regardless of what side of the political aisle they're on, or whether they're from a small company or a large company, because it solves so many. We're in this conversation. We're in an insular community. It's dominated by regulations and barriers to entry and law enforcement. But I think that the larger picture does get overshadowed by the fact that here's an amazing technology that can not only suck the dead weight out of many bad industries, but will create entire new economies and new entrants to financial systems. Whole swaths of populations of the world that have never had access to the financial networks. Seamless liquidity between asset classes that are just having bits and pieces shredded out, for nothingness into the economy. Huge potential upside. The problem is that a lot of these companies aren't able to show proof of concept because the regulations impose, create legal liability and criminal liability from day one, from transaction one. So, I know a lot of companies would love to test out with 2,000 beta users, or would love to implement a local economy, local digital currency economy that shows how much the people's, the community saved. But it's just, you can't do that without regulatory risk. And right now, in order to do these experiments, you still need to hook up with the existing financial institutions. So you have to usually hook up with a bank account and have a banking relationship. So you just have a lot of these. And in fact, if you have the right conversation with a banker, the incentives are aligned. There's a whole new value creations here. Yes, maybe being a central banker won't be great in 100 years, but right now you're in a position of great power, of great adaptation, of you're at the center of a financial network that you can adapt your existing business models to all of these different opportunities. It's just that so that conversation is easy to have. It's just that you need to create a network of these conversations, and it is happening, but it's percolating in small pockets, and there's a lot of uncertainty. So I think getting to proof of concept is going to be very, very important. And I think changing the dialogue, the narrative of what this is and what it can do, will definitely shift the public policy mandates around it. So showing proof of concept and having these proactive dialogues that are solving problems, I think will hopefully make those two universes meet.
I have a feeling it'll always be good to be a central banker. Maybe that's just a hypothesis of mine. Does anybody have any other questions?
It's a very difficult relationship to balance because banks are already in an odd spot with regulators based on 2008, and they're still rebuilding their reputation, and they're succumbed to so much regulation. And to take something as French as Bitcoin and then have banks bank these French companies is adding more risk to already one of the most risky areas of our economy, and so banks just aren't really willing to make this connection. And another thing that we're challenging are the reputational issues of Bitcoin, which there's been a lot of miscommunication. There's been a lot of scandals that the media has turned into crazy hype. We spend this today. I was on Bloomberg interviewing about Silk Road, and I kept trying to change the conversation to the legitimate players in this space, because there's way more legitimate players than these nefarious players. But for whatever reason, this is what people are focused on. And so that doesn't help when we're trying to build relationships with well-regulated institutions. So one thing that we're looking to do in DC is to take a financial services regulator and host a hearing about what is it going to take to open up these floodgates. How can Bitcoin businesses be transparent to the financial system and answering a lot of these tough questions of what exactly are their intentions? Are they trying to overthrow the financial services sector? Because we've heard this too, which is crazy. But laying this out for the financial institutions, and then going back to the financial institutions and asking them, what is it going to take from these digital currency businesses for you to be able to bank them? And I think by having that dialogue from a financial services or a banking regulator would be the appropriate venue to have that. But it is one of the biggest friction points of this industry, and without bridging that gap, it's seriously going to hinder adoption.
Yeah, one thing that I think it's helpful for people in the community to understand is a lot of people who they're starting up a company that uses virtual currency or Bitcoin. They feel like the bank doesn't understand them, and if they are able to explain to the bank why their particular business is low risk, they would then be able to get a banking relationship. That's not the case. I mean, that assumes that dramatically understates how risk-averse banks are. And like an example of that is, within the last year, a number of the largest banks in the United States have refused to process transactions for European diplomats, right? And it's not because they think European diplomats are all criminals. It's because they're not making that much money on the diplomat accounts, and they have to pay some compliance person to monitor a bunch of transactions that they don't really understand, and they're not making enough money for it to be worth their while. And part of the reason it's not worth their while is because regulators put some pressure on them, but also it's just not that lucrative in the short term. So for some banks, it may well be a rational decision, either because you're asking me to do something new and I don't have anybody trained to do that, and I'm not going to make that much money on processing your account. And in addition, it may be a rational decision because regulators put a tremendous amount of pressure on them. The regulators are a little bit nervous about something new, and it's just not worth the risk for the bank. So it's a real problem, and I think one thing to just keep in mind is that it's not necessarily just a problem of the bank not understanding the industry. In some instances, it's a rational decision for the bank. It depends on the individual bank. So it's important that you be able to persuade the bank, somehow that this is going to be sufficiently profitable for the bank to be willing to undertake the expense of doing something new and figuring out how to run compliance for something that's relatively new. And you've seen that happened for other industries. Like there were some banks in the past who they didn't want to be involved with ACH transactions because there was potential massive liability. And in fact, there have been cases where banks have been prosecuted or had individuals at the banks prosecuted because of what happened with their ACH transactions. So there was real risk, but there was tremendous upside. And I think in order to really build a relationship with a bank, you have to be able to persuade the bank that there is real short-term financial upside to starting to process Bitcoin transactions. And that requires giving a vision of not just how much money they can make next week, but how much they'll make over the next year. And if we can't do that, it's going to be very difficult to persuade banks to take on Bitcoin companies as customers.
Yeah, I would say that it really is the either a lack of education, the reputational risk, or just a rational business judgment about the risk-benefit analysis of the fees versus the risk. So, and what's happening is a lot of the smaller banks might be small enough to make a decision, but then their correspondent bank network will then shut them down for taking on an account that has processes Bitcoin transactions. So it's a whole ecosystem. It's an interdependent network of banks. And if a larger bank along that chain shuts it down, then that trickles down to the smaller banks. And typically the larger banks, because of the reputational risk, have to take a lot longer to make these kinds of policy decisions. So it's really troubling because you can only access the financial network through a bank, and so and the bank is a private company that has complete discretion over whether to take your business or not. So that's the situation right now.
Not to diminish startups and a lot of the regulations from the Bitcoin exchange world, because I know how difficult it is, but regulations here to protect consumers. We saw Mt. Gox, there wasn't really a level of transparency. I'm just wondering what your opinion is on maybe helping to shape some more regulation for these digital currency companies that does have a kind of digital anonymous transparency that in turn kind of shows that they are a good actor. And when bigger players do come in, as larger institutions do come in, we already have something kind of built in to then kind of help society in that regard.
So just a comment on that. If you talk to any of the folks who were in the ecosystem and credible players while all that was playing out, all of them that we've spoken to had indications that Mt. Gox was not being operated efficiently. So in that case, actually the network knew. The associated pieces weren't around it to filter that insight back to individuals, but the key players in the system knew, didn't actually require any regulation or centralized body to understand it. So just, sure.
What, in terms of regulation, could...
So I think what you're getting at is something that Superintendent Losky sort of hinted at, where he said a lot of folks talk about how this technology can essentially, you can bake in some of the regulation into the technology itself, and there isn't a proof of concept of that. And actually there are some open source projects and some companies who are doing this, where, for example, you can prove cryptographically the reserves that a company has. You can't see what individual balances people have, et cetera, but you can be certain through the technology how much money. So looking at Mt. Gox, you could have told they didn't have the money that they said they did. So that's going to have to be accepted by a regulator. So I don't think it's as easy as, so sure, you can build it out. I think the regulator is going to have to accept that as fulfilling a requirement. So yeah, there are technological aspects that can be built in.
And also, DATA was formed, the nonprofit trade association was formed in July of last year, precisely to start building out best practices across data security, AML, privacy and ID, and consumer protection. And what we were trying to do was kind of distill all of the information and knowledge base inside the community, what these companies are actually doing, and disseminate that out to new entrepreneurs and new consumers so that we could elevate the floor of the industry, stop, have people have, best practices in multi-signature or cold storage, have consumer disclosures that someone like you or, someone who wasn't aware of Bitcoin last year on Mt. Gox could go to as a central repository of information to test their companies against. So that's ongoing. We've got best practices guidelines in draft form right now, which we're hoping to disseminate. And hopefully with Jerry Brito and Perry Ann's new organizations, there will be much more of that dissemination of that knowledge base to the average consumer.
I think what's exciting most about blockchain technology is you can actually build a more secure system, using things like proof of solvency, using things like multi-sig, using the powerful transparency aspect of blockchain. You can actually build a better system, a system that existing financial institutions may not be able to compete with. I mean, that's what's exciting about it. So, yeah.
Getting an insurance
So there's a startup in London called Elliptic, and they're one of the first companies to offer custody and an insurance product in the Bitcoin space. And I'd keep an eye on the London market for precedent on those types of businesses.
Yeah, and part of the reason was that, a lot of these companies tried to have the big four accounting firms go in last year, and no one would do it because they just didn't have the subject matter expertise. There were also stories of people going out for director liability insurance at some of these companies, and they literally couldn't get D&O insurance because the premiums they were getting were, I think it was $2 million cap, $500,000 in a yearly premium. So basically, they couldn't price the risk. So the ecosystem is catching up. So you're seeing, the banks, financial institutions getting a little more knowledgeable about how this works. You're seeing, Ernst & Young now starting to develop auditing practices. They just did second market. So I think you will see evolution of that. It's just that people don't know what they don't know, and a lot of these insurance companies don't know.
And the current regulation basically if this was adopted today, the DFS is effectively requiring exchanges to self-insure, because it's requiring them to keep on a one-to-one basis all of the deposits that are being made externally, and in addition, have a bond that the DFS will impose on the institution and meet capital requirements. And if it does all those things, it's effectively self-insuring.
It's overinsured, I'd say.
So that seems to be the approach that's in this, and I think insurance might be a good alternative.
So I think when you are talking about insurance, it might be a good time to stop. We've been going at this for a while. So I wanted to thank you all for coming here today. I know some of you came in from out of town and participating. It was really insightful and informative. I think that there's some food outside if anybody wants to stay.